Alan watched the animosity in the air grow. Liam's face was a mess of tears and spit as his weakened body tried to convey his anger. He watched on silently. The revelation that Nathaniel had committed an atrocity like this was no real surprise to him. Nathaniel was a trained killer. In 5 years on the road, nothing had scared the old man. Until now. Amy had her arms wrapped around Liam, who was on his back resting on shaking elbows. "Is this true?" She glared at Nathaniel. Nathaniel continued to peer into the campfire, revisiting that memory he had locked away in the vault of his mind the day he left the Enclave. In the small campfire, he could see the burning house and the dead woman lying face down in the dirt. "I didn't choose that life." He finally broke his silence. "I spent the first 7 years of my life on an oil rig. I had no understanding of the world. I'd heard of dry land, but for the longest time all I had was ocean on all sides, the smell of diesel in my nose, and the ideology of the Enclave pumped into my brain, day in, day out." He spoke clearly, but still stared into the flames. "I was fortunate enough to be a part of the Enclave's true humanity, and I listened to every word because I dreamed of one day being able to board the vertibirds, to see the real world for myself. It was all I wanted. And then, when I was taught to carry out the Enclave's will, I couldn't comprehend the possibility that we were in fact the abominations. That day, we were sent to find a pre-war bunker, and we knew that the locals didn't like us. We thought the locals were hiding it from us, so we punished them. I saw you that day." Nathaniel turned to glance at Liam, forcing himself to face the boy. "And I know you saw me, and what we did to her." Nathaniel swallowed. His throat was dry, and Liam's anger was only trumped by the sheer frustration he felt, wishing he had the energy to stand up and hit him. Nathaniel was glad it wouldn't come to that. He turned back to the fire. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but that flight in the vertibird back to headquarters was the longest of my life. I took my armor and my gun, and I left. I thought they'd hunt me down and kill me for deserting, but I didn't care. I knew I had to leave." He turned to Liam once again, not really knowing what to expect, but he was unconscious again. Alan moved over to him and checked his pulse. "He's passed out from the shock. I think we need to leave the poor kid alone for a while. I'm going to go stretch my legs." Alan picked up his satchel and wandered away from the camp. Amy pulled the bedroll over Liam's shoulders. The shakes had gradually subsided and he was breathing steadily at last. She sat opposite Nathaniel with the fading campfire between them. "You know, growing up as a girl with nothing in this shithole we call home, I've met my fair share of sadistic, cruel, crooked assholes. It's rare to find someone who hasn't committed evils. The only thing rarer than that is finding someone capable of great evil who has the strength to see themselves for what they really are, to seek redemption instead of an excuse. When you saved me from those mercenaries and mutants and sat with me at the campfire, I saw a good man. I saw the kind of person I wanted to be." Amy smiled, and Nathaniel managed to wrench his lips up into a grin, straining against the pain of his reminiscence. He picked up the bottle, pulled out the stopper with a satisfying pop, and drank deep. He replaced the stopper and handed the bottle to Amy. "Do you think I'd make it this far as an arms dealer by listening to my pa and the other settlers?" Amy said, stopping momentarily to take a drink. "I miss the old man like crazy, but he was never able to protect me. You taught me more by example than any of them did." Nathaniel smiled, more easily this time. The camp was silent, bar the crackling of the fire. They relaxed and just soaked it all in. Alan savoured the cool night air. He always found that walking alone was the best way to process his thoughts. A part of him relished in the knowledge that he wasn't so different to everyone else out here. Everyone seemed a little fucked up in their own way, and his decision not to let his desires get the better of him, killing Nathaniel, was the main reason he felt safe travelling the Commonwealth. He hadn't lost sight of his overall goal. If saving that kid's life against all odds wasn't proof enough of his skill, nothing was. As he walked, he noticed his pocket radio buzzing in his satchel. He pulled it out and the buzzing intensified, turning into the grating sound of static. The needle displaying the frequency was thrashing from side to side. It was as if the thing was being supercharged, and then he began to feel the energy in the air. 10 paces in front of him, the dark veil of night was ripped open by electric blue light, and out of the chaos stepped a man in a shiny grey trench coat and black sunglasses. He removed his glasses and paced over to Alan. Alan Summers, the man started in a methodical tone. We have been watching you for some time. We are impressed by your efficacy. Alan nodded, suddenly aware of who the man meant by we. He had to prevent himself from showing his overwhelming enthusiasm. I am X917, Courser of the Institute. I am here to offer you a place in our organization. You have shown yourself to be an intelligent and effective man of science, and your talents would be better utilized with us. Father will be pleased to make your acquaintance if you accept this offer. Alan's excitement was palpable. He looked over his shoulder, wondering what would happen back at camp. If only he could tell them. But the Institute would never allow such a thing. They didn't uphold their mystery-shrouded reputation by telling the commoners every time they recruited a new member. I accept, Alan said finally. X917 nodded. Please stand still, sir. The Courser unfolded his glasses and put them back over his eyes, and then in an instant they were both engulfed by blue light. The electric flash sparked into the night air, disturbing the tranquility once again, and then the street was empty, the static buzzing replaced with a deep silence. Amy woke shivering. The fire had completely gone out, but it was still the middle of the night. Their small block of Boston was quiet, yet she dreamed the place was alive with noise and unnatural light. She sat up, finding her jacket before getting to her feet and walking a short distance from the camp to relieve her full bladder. She muttered a curse under her breath, ruining her decision to drink so much whiskey on an empty stomach. Once she was out of sight, she relieved herself. Once again, she swore she could hear something, except this time, it wasn't a hum. It was the chatter of men, and it was coming from the camp. She buckled her belt and walked hastily back to their campsite. As she drew closer, she heard the voices again, only now they were loud and commanding. She rounded the corner and saw flashlights. Liam was not lying in his bedroll, and Nathaniel was knocked unconscious, being dragged by a large man dressed in what she could tell were military green fatigues under plates of rusted steel armor. As one of the flashlights passed over Nathaniel and his captor, she saw the unmistakable skull icon with the cross on its forehead, painted clumsily on the chest plate. Fucking gunners, she whispered to herself. She tried to make out more of the scene using the constantly moving flashlights. There were 2 carts and about 10 men. One cart had Liam slumped in it, and Nathaniel was being dragged in to join him. The other, half covered by a tarp, were the mini-nukes. The bastards had stolen her cargo. She began to panic. 10 gunners had custody of her protection and her only hope of repaying Carmine, and her gun was lying somewhere amongst them, outnumbered and unarmed. She watched them go. Once the flashlights were gone, she stumbled through the darkness towards the camp. The first thing she managed to find on the stool beside the burned-out campfire was a flip lighter. She flicked it open, and a little flame that burst into life restored her vision. Enough of it at least to see her immediate surroundings. Nathaniel's weapon was gone, so too was Liam's sniper. She rustled through her travel pack in hopes of finding her pistol, but it was gone along with her 2 boxes of ammunition. Everything of use was gone. She tossed her pack aside in anger. Her only hope was to find Dutch. She knew the general direction of Bunker Hill, but it would be difficult to find it in complete darkness. But she had an idea, even if it was a dangerous one. She pulled a stick from the pile of excess firewood and tore a layer of cloth from her bedroll. She wrapped the cloth around the stick and drained the remnants of the whiskey bottle onto the makeshift torch. She set it alight with the flip lighter and started to walk, knowing full well that she was carrying a beacon, advertising her vulnerability to anything that lurked in the shadows. But she had no choice. Dutch sat on a bar stool with one too short leg, leaning his elbows on a grimy bench top, sipping foul-tasting whiskey. People often commented on the permanent scowl he always wore with his sour attitude, but tonight Dutch felt it was absolutely justified. He almost wished someone would start a fight, at least then he'd have something to take his mind off Amy. But Bunker Hill's insipid bar was equally as bland as the people who drank in it. He shook his empty glass and let off a grunt. Old Tony Savoldi sighed and poured the ghoul another drink in response. Dutch knew he was at that point. He no longer noticed how mediocre the whiskey was, and he was even surprised when he noticed the sun starting to rise. He was technically indoors, but Bunker Hill's idea of shelter was rusted sheets of tin, worn through in some places and littered in bullet holes in others. So Dutch watched the first rays of morning peek in through the mishmash of holes and decided he ought to call it a night. He sculled his whiskey and slapped a handful of caps on the counter. Then he strolled toward the front gate. He rented a mattress from Joe Savoldi, but he knew he'd better sleep with a bit of fresh air and a little look at the outside world. He slid out the front gate and made his way down the steps before leaning against a lamppost and reaching for a cigarette. He chuckled to himself as he lit it. It was unusual lighting up without Amy around to preach about the dangers of smoking. She could never see the irony in telling a ghoul to worry about such trivial health concerns. He smoked in the orange glow of morning, gazing down the street ahead for some time. In the distance, he noticed a silhouette sprinting in his direction. The figure was trailed by two others, and then he heard a noise he'd never mistake, the screech of ferals. As they came into view, he saw that it was a woman running from them. It was Amy! He spat his cigarette onto the ground and pulled his revolver from his holster. Amy hadn't noticed him yet. She turned and swung what looked like a stick at the closer feral. Dutch couldn't line up a clear shot, and then she continued to run. Finally, she saw him, and in a moment of trust, she threw herself to the ground, giving up the escape in order to buy him a clear shot. Dutch aimed and fired. Once, twice, one after the other. He watched their heads explode. He heard the pops from the other end of the street. Amy got back to her feet and ran to him. After a few hours' rest, Amy forced herself to get up. She explained the situation to Dutch, and they both knew that they could do nothing about the others and their cargo without some caps. She had to meet the contact to reassure him of their goodwill. Dutch led her across Bunker Hill to a shack at the end of town. The shack was in shambles, but it was larger and less sprinkled with bullet holes than every other she'd seen so far. So that was a good sign that this client was the real deal. With Dutch in tow, she knocked twice on the reinforced tin door. The door opened and a man in a dirty business suit greeted her with a nod and gestured them to come in. Amy had a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach as they were led to the back of the room, but it had been sinking since the night before. When this ordeal was over, she would sleep for a week. They walked into the back room, and standing directly across from them, flanked by 4 henchmen, armed with assault rifles, stood Carmine. The well-dressed man locked the door behind them, drew a pistol from his jacket, and pressed it against the back of Amy's head.